Hello, listeners. I'm Kathy Feng with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host Am Johal is joined by artist and curator Germaine Koh. Together, they chat about some of Germaine's work, including her ongoing project League and the incorporation of sport into art. Germaine also shares stories about receiving the Governor General's Award, the importance of unproductivity, and her projects on Salt Spring Island. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted you could join us again. This week we are at our studios at 312 Main Street with our special guest, Germaine Koh. Welcome, Germaine.
Thanks for having me.
Germaine, why don't we begin with you introducing yourself a little bit?
Sure. I have taken to describing myself as an artist and organizer who makes work that ranges quite widely in terms of media. That can include interactive installations, urban interventions, but I also, in the organizing vein, I've started up a few different artist organizations and initiatives. So it's a bit wide-ranging.
Nice.
Yeah.
My first question I wanted to start with was just, how did you find yourself getting involved in the art world or becoming an artist? What was the thing that kind of tipped you over the edge that this was the direction that you went?
Well, I've had reason to sort of tell the story recently, which is that I went into university as a young person who had a lot of different interests and didn't want to give them all up. And it felt like being involved in the arts was a way that you could maintain all of those different interests and not have to, foreclose some of them. So that's where it started. And so my interests in sports, in how things get administered and policy and like questions of strategy, questions of, language and so on could all be maintained. I could maintain those kinds of research interests.
Mm-hmm. You're currently a Shadbolt Fellow at SFU, and you're already involved in a bunch of different activities and classes and things. And I know you're doing some collaboration in theater and performance. Wondering if you can maybe share a little bit about some of the work you've been doing at SFU.
Sure. Well, at SFU, I'm officially based in the Urban Studies department. So I've been sitting in on some of the classes there, talking particularly when there's subject matter that lies close to my own interests. Like I sat in on a class on ethics in urban space, and we'll do another one around housing informality. So I've done a lot of that, ties in with some of the work I've done around construction. And then this term, I'm participating quite heavily in a course that James Long in the performance department has organized, sort of growing out of an ongoing project I have around play as a form of creative practice. And this project called League is one in which the premise of it is we gather community members together to play and invent new sports and games. And that has in turn grown into a couple instances where we organized a tournament of invented sports called the N Games. So in this performance class, we're doing a lot of workshops around game development and play as a form of problem solving, but also creating problems, new problems to be solved, with the idea that we're going to bring all of that together into another sort of event around presenting invented games to the public.
Now you've launched or presented League in several formats and places.
Yes.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the other iterations that League has taken on.
Sure. Yeah. So we've so I launched League maybe about 10 years ago now as one of the projects that was housed in the Vancouver Park Board's Field House program. So I was based at had the use of the Field House at Elm Park out in Kerrisdale. And the premise there was that we would gather people sort of once a week, and we would sometimes there would be a prompt, like we'd tell people, bring a stick. Some people would bring hockey sticks and lacrosse sticks, but other people, broomsticks, bamboo sticks, chopsticks, USB sticks, things like that. And we would just make a game with that. So it would be like each week we would sort of explore different prompts or different starting points. And it was a chance to sort of explore collective problem solving, what happens through iteration, what happens through conversation, what happens through, when we suspend the relationships that we have in our daily life and enter this, what play theorists would call this, the magic circle of play, a place where you feel like you're in a protected space, suspended from the outside world. So that was the sort of ongoing presence that thing had. And then there were a few different special events, including a couple iterations of this End Games tournament, which ran kind of like a sports tournament. I mean, it was great because we would have, we invited a bunch of different teams. So there would be, for example, there would be business teams. We had, a pretty high profile advertising firm. They sent a team. Video game development companies sent a team. We had the Double Rainbow Dodgeball League sent an all-star team. There was it was pretty neat. And so it would be time for the next match, and we would literally draw a paper out of a hat that had the rules of the game that they were going to play. So they were read the rules of the game immediately before they had to play it. And then so it was really the kind of immediate strategizing that they would have to do, and rely on their knowledge of their different teammates' relative aptitudes and skills. Who were the strategists, who were the physical people, who were the So it was very interesting.
Besides just the sheer joy and fun of bringing people together to do this sort of random sets of activity, as structured as they are, what were some of the aesthetic or artistic questions at play in the work?
Right. So, I mean, when you bring artists into play, there's also, the better way to put it is when you get people coming from not necessarily sports backgrounds, but from different kinds of backgrounds, you start to understand pretty quickly that some of the conventions around sports competition, they're kind of odd, and that there's other ways you could approach them, right? Starting from the, questioning whether competition is even necessary, right? Or else picking up on some of the interesting particularities that have grown out of sports. So, for example, one of the games that we played during the End Games was, I think it's called, I can't remember, the names are really great, but this one was based on soccer, but the idea was that each team would get to change one of the rules of soccer or start to change the rules. And so one of the teams decided that the rule that they were going to change is that after you make contact with the ball, you have to dive and roll around as if you're injured, which is, kind of a thing that happens in soccer anyway, but this was now the rule that you had to do that. And so all of a sudden you had to play differently because you had to take into account the time it takes for you to fall on the ground and roll around before you could then get up and play on the ball again or whatever. But it's anything looked at from a different lens or deliberately misunderstood, is going to produce interesting results. So.
Wow, League took on so many different directions. What are some other things that came out?
Okay, so at some point we decided we should do a kind of like Petrakucha type event, but since we're in the realm of sports, everything needed to be participatory or embodied. That it would be a kind of presentation event, short presentation event, but all embodied presentation. So we had, for example, Bruce Emmett, who's an artist and educator and has this ongoing project where he's trying to convince people to dig up the first skate park that was built in North Vancouver. So we kind of laid out that on the field. We had one of the teachers from the Take a Hike program, which is an alternative outdoor education program. He did a kind of like embodied first aid kind of exercise. We had your friend Matt Hearn there, and Matt was one of the, I want to say, star participants in Justin Langlois' activity, which was not a series of debates, but a series of arm wrestling matches, right? Where the debate was physical rather than auditory, right? And so, yeah, we called that event Push Up Kucha instead of Push Up Kucha. So
sounds right up Hearn's alley.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. I don't even remember what Matt had presented on. But yeah, it made me think that there's more room for embodied dialogue events. Yeah,
totally.
And so we should totally book out the Center for Dialogue here at SFU and do something there.
I love it. Love it. Now you've been an athlete for a long time. I know you did roller derby for a long time, but also other sports over the years. And a number of your artistic projects, they happen out in public space. They can be kind of a spectacle in many different ways. Just before we were on the air, we were talking about a boxing match you had staged in Toronto. But wondering if you can speak a little bit to kind of these public interventions in urban space and kind of what the kind of stakes are that you have in attempting to kind of disrupt the everyday urban life of the city and to take up public space in different ways or to intervene into urban texture and kind of what the possibilities of what can happen when that happens.
Right. So a lot of my works, they derive from a belief and a faith in general audiences being able to, having the capacity to, recognize patterns of behavior, think through what happens when those are shifted or changed. And so a lot of the work that I do, it really draws upon commonplace phenomena like situations that we recognize, familiar objects, a knowledge about how spaces are typically used, and so on. To me, these are like points of references that are a rich source of common knowledge and common purpose and so on, right? So the piece that you mentioned of the boxing match, that was derived from me. I'm always on the lookout when I'm out in public spaces and like observing patterns of behavior and so on. And I'd always noticed this funny space at in downtown Toronto at the foot of University Avenue where it meets Front Street. There was this square concrete pad with some chains around it, and I think it was protecting it because it was underneath. It was the vent for a parking garage. But I always thought it looked like a boxing ring. And of course, this is downtown Toronto business district, and so it's surrounded by these office buildings that surround this little grassy area. So it had really this feeling of being like almost like an arena, And the downtown business district, of course, is a place where we have all these ritualized meetings and even like a kind of combative situations sometimes. So I thought, okay, well, let's mash up the language of business conflict with sports conflict. And so I challenged this other artist to meet me at this site at high noon and fight me. So we arrived, and we both had gym clothing under our street clothes. So we stripped down to our gym clothes, and we had someone planted in the audience who was on her bicycle, and she rang her bike bell to start and end the few rounds of boxing. And so it was completely it was announced within the art world, but the larger audience was an accidental audience of passersby, and so it becomes like it presents this kind of like situation, which at once it's sort of presenting a situation that everyone who sees it would recognize is not going to last very long. Not only if one of us, gets knocked out or whatever, but it was, it's not a thing that is going to last very long. So it sort of calls for a kind of attention and a kind of like thinking through in the moment what is going on here and so on. So to me, it's like creating a situation that's asking for an active participation on the part of an audience or something. We did get some, unsolicited coaching advice from the audience and so on, but yeah.
In terms of some of the projects or games or sports that were sort of invented through League, were there some that had promise as a kind of like something that could last, that you could see that like, wow, I could see this really becoming a thing?
Yeah, there were some actually. So I'll give you an example of one in particular that had particular relevance once at the beginning of COVID. So there was a game that we played called Petrie. And so a lot of the games, they end up being like mashups between other games, or there's bits that you can recognize from other games. So I would call this a cross between bocce and curling. So we drew out a bunch of circles on the ground, and those were Petri dishes. And then we had a bunch of different kinds of balls, like two different sets of colored balls. Like maybe one was even stones, and one was like, golf balls or something like that. They're quite different. They had quite different character, and so the teams would take turns pitching their set of balls into the Petri dishes, and the balls represented different kinds of molecules. And so if you managed to land your ball into a Petri dish that one of your opponents already had a ball in, that would inoculate so it would neutralize their scoring or their ball, right? So And then when we went to score the things, if they had been neutralized, there's no score. The scoring would be by multiplication. So if you had 3 balls, it was sort of like you would, the cube of the score that you would get anyway. It'd be like, in any case, it was a chance for runaway scoring.
Yeah, right.
And in a way that we started to understand, all of us collectively understand, when pandemic came around and we were all of a sudden talking, on the street about our values and like, whoa, and trying to not let the effect to run away. So it was like, I felt like that was a game that fully came into its own at the beginning of pandemic.
Yeah. Now, I want to come back to roller derby. I'll swing back to art in a bit. But like you did that for a number of years. You were deeply involved.
I was, yes. Yeah. I mean, roller derby is a really interesting sport. What would you like to know about roller derby? Can I just tell you a little bit about it?
Just in terms of your involvement, how you got involved. And I imagine you did it purely for the sport, but maybe there was an artistic, cultural kind of aspect to it as well. Mm-hmm. There's certainly a performative aspect to it.
Yeah. I mean, roller derby, which takes the form of, these days, it's mostly women's flat track roller derby. So it's no longer on the kind of bank tracks that you would have had in the 1970s. And it's more like takes place in spaces similar to a hockey rink would hold it, or tennis court even. It's a really interesting community because it involves a lot of people for whom it's the first sport they've played or the first team sport that they've played. It's people coming from a wide variety of cultural communities. It's a sport that is really insistent on, having a sensitive approach towards questions of gender, and to the extent that it's really like a sport that has been leading in terms of developing policy around gender inclusivity in sport, right? It's really community, grassroots led, right? Like, I mean, I guess a lot of amateur sports is kind of self-organized, but especially roller derby is really only that. So for sure, I entered it as someone who has played a lot of sports before, but they had lots of teammates who'd not ever done sports before. And so a lot of it was something else that I'm interested in, which is like kind of learning, just embodied learning. And so there was a lot of people that were just like experiencing the world of sports in a new way, and again, forging maybe a different way of doing sports.
And so you're an early stage pickleball player, early stage.
I think we've come to a point where we all have to play pickleball at some point.
I'm so ready for pickleball.
Yeah, I know.
Can't wait. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I know that you were an artist in residence in the engineering department. You've done so many different types of residencies, but that one's particular because when people think about the engineering department, they don't think of an artist in residence. But wondering if you can speak a little bit to your time doing that.
For sure. So I was the first engineering artist in residence for the City of Vancouver. That would have been between 2018 and 2020. So they started that as a kind of pilot project with the idea that would be a way of integrating art projects into infrastructure projects. Now, one thing people may not realize is that the kind of budgets for infrastructure projects like sewer projects or, road projects the budgets are hugely bigger than the typical public art or projects that get public art funding, right? And so the idea of trying to find a way of integrating public art into those kinds of projects was a really tantalizing one. What I started to realize is that there, along with that initiative and that interest, needed to come a fair amount of internal education about how artists operate, what would be needed to bring art projects into a sewer project, for example. And that is those kinds of questions, administrative questions, are something that public art offices do, but the public art office here had not previously been involved in those kinds of projects. That maybe might have been more detail than we needed to go into. But for sure, it tends to be, I think it's fair to say that artists and engineers tend to operate differently. It's not...
Even after a deeply immersive project, it's still the case.
Well, I mean, some of us do. Like, I think I have a pretty... it's just that the creative activity that happens at a different points. Like engineers there's many engineers who are really creative people, actually. Yeah. Like their jobs are all about kind of problem solving, right? But so to introduce art into those can take the form of like a wrench in the works. And on the side of artists, we're sometimes not used to doing all of the advanced planning before we are allowed to make things. We just want to make things. And so lots of artists don't, they don't accept that you have to do all of this kind of like, you have to do up all the drawings and make sure they're structurally sound and all of that before you're ever allowed to make a thing. And so sometimes those two worlds don't find a way of working together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to bring up, I remember when you did the project at Center A with the bottles, and I remember you were in touch with Ken Liotier, who passed away just a couple of years ago. We actually interviewed him just a few weeks before he passed. But wondering if you can speak to that project. You've done so many other kind of urban interventions, but that was a really interesting project at Center A.
Yeah, that was a really exciting one, and I think one that they really still they remember really fondly at Center A, because it ended up creating forging a slightly different relationship with the public than most of their projects did, and I'll explain why. So the idea was that I started out with this premise, like, why don't we create a kind of experimental situation where we'll divert into the gallery some of the enormous flow of bottles that passes through the downtown east side, because binning has been such an important, not always recognized part of the local economy, right? So we made this agreement with Ken over at United We Can that we would take, for the duration of this project, a few months, all of the bottles that they received that they couldn't give people refunds for because they were, they were either broken or else they were like not the kind of bottles that have refunds attached to them, and that we would just sort of we would collect those in the gallery. So there became this kind of shifting mass of bottles. We cleaned them and they were just sitting on the floor of the gallery, and almost like this kind of like a tidal flow, or a wave of stuff, right? And it would shift around, like it had no kind of fixed situation. But at the same time, these bottles were standing on the ground, and they, the shape of a bottle has a sort of anthropomorphic shape to it, right? It's got shoulders and a neck, so you can think of it almost like as a kind of stand-in for a person. Plus, we ingest the contents of a body, so there's like it's a stand-in for a person in some way. But it created this really kind of interesting situation where you'd get people with their faces pressed up against the window, just like looking at the bottles, like really examining them, assessing their value and stuff like that. And you would get people coming in and really wanting to talk about how in fact the bottles that we had there were actually not valuable at all. Because so there was like this interesting inversion of expertise between the citizens of the street and the people in the gallery. You normally think of the gallery as wants to be the place where they hold the expertise. But in fact, in this case, it was the community that was bringing this expertise about this bottle, and people would want to come in and talk about these bottles. And there also developed a kind of attitude or an agreement that this installation represented a kind of a sort of memorial to people who had suffered substance abuse, right? And so it was an interesting case of a piece that was set out as an experimental piece, with some calculation that maybe it might be, could be understood in those terms, and just kickstarted and operated.
Wondering, I know that more recently you're looking at starting some artist residencies over on Salt Spring Island. Wondering if you can speak to that.
Sure. Well, the residency that I've started operating on Salt Spring, it arises out of an ongoing project. I have a lot of ongoing projects. Good at starting things, not so good at bringing them to a close. So one of the ongoing projects is that I have an initiative I call Homemade Home, which is to look at alternative forms of housing, that could be in the form of small-scale housing that can be self-built, mobile houses like tiny houses on wheels and so on. And so some of these building projects that I've done have needed to be located in a specific place. And so the place where they have been located is on a piece of property that I, in quotation marks, own, understanding that our property system is a fundamentally invalid colonial construction. Yeah. But within that colonial construction, I quote unquote own a piece of property. And we've been doing some of these building experiments there, and usually involving people who want to learn some construction skills, or, people who are just fired up about the idea of thinking through these questions collectively. So the very first structure that we built was a 10 by 10 foot off-grid studio over on Salt Spring, solar powered. And then as soon as we finished it, people started using it as kind of like a getaway. There's the people that had the sweat equity in helping to build it. And so it started being used as an unofficial artist residency and retreat immediately. So we've, over the years, that's about 8 years ago that we finished that, that has started to become more and more formalized as a destination for people to come and do, especially, either get away in order to do work, or to get away from work, or sometimes to sleep, or to, use as a place to go hiking, or, so either a space to be productive or a space not to be productive, eat, have campfires, have good conversations, and so on. So I'm starting to formalize it so that we can start to offer people artist fees when they want to do things that do intersect with the public. But at the same time, I feel like it's really important to keep some part of that residency informal so that people can come and go on very short notice, or that they don't have to feel the pressure to be productive, which is super important. And you might think, oh, people are going to take advantage of it and not do anything. And it's like, but honestly, most of the artists I know, and of course I know a lot of artists, they work so hard, and what they really, really need sometimes is just to catch up on their sleep, or just to try to find some space where a new thought could enter their mind in between all of the productivity that we're conditioned to.
I was just telling you
continue.
Last night I was reading Byung-Chul Han's Vita Contemplative, and just a lot of the themes around the importance of unproductivity, or like that creates the place of reflection, and how much of our lives, even our leisure time, gets commodified and taken over by a kind of production. So important. It's totally needed. Like we're all just sitting around the production office here of Kathy's, and I'm just like, when can I go?
But it also, that it actually relates to that whole question about play. And in this research I've done around play and what happens during play, the kinds of breakthroughs and so on, there are folks who point out that some of our greatest breakthroughs happen when people pursue the kind of anomalies that aren't really on their program of work, if you will. Like the example that I often use is the physicist Andre Geim, who's to this day one of the only person who has won both a Nobel and an Ig Nobel Prize. The Ig Nobels are for what research that seems like it's frivolous at first, but then produces interesting results. And he talked in his Nobel Prize speech about how important it was to pursue these kinds of questions that seemed frivolous at the time, but that are right. That's a really key part of his route to eventual breakthroughs, right?
Yeah, if they don't put any, rules around you, Germaine Koh, there's going to be like some sort of life-size public crokinole thing in the middle of Salt Spring soon.
Well, actually, we did build.
That'd be actually kind of fun.
Well, we did sort of build something like that because on Salt Spring, everybody has little farm stands, roadside produce stands. So I thought, okay, well, we should have a roadside produce stand. But I don't want it to be just a place for vegetables. I want it to be a place that will be where you might encounter the unexpected. So instead of a produce stand, we just built a kind of a platform, a multi-purpose platform that can be sort of the size of it is basically the size of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, but it's sized so that it's kind of like a table height, but it could also be used as a small stage or something like that. This was recently completed, so I'm thinking it's going to be a site for sometimes performances, sometimes exhibitions, sometimes there's a kind of like a chest that appears on it that looks like a loot box, and so I think people will understand that as being you open the chest and whatever's in there you can take it. The people, gamers, that's what they're used to. You see a loot box and you open it and it's yours.
Germaine, you recently got the Governor General's Award.
Yeah, that was weird.
Congratulations.
Thank you. That was weird.
I want to hear some like inside story of what that whole process looks like, going to the Governor General's house, like all the...
Well, okay. I want to say the very best thing, part of that whole week, well, it's a bizarre week because, you know, the life of an artist, it's like unrelenting criticism. Except there's this, for me, there was like this one week where people turn around and say, yeah, actually you're doing good.
A little, yeah. Well, every few decades or so, a little bit of positive reinforcement is like, it means a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's like, you know, the set roles within the art world are such that, you know, you put stuff out there in order for it to be torn right down again. Critically torn down. But yeah. So this particular year, they did. They usually have an evening gala that is quite a big deal. This year, because they hadn't done a ceremony for the past 3 years because of COVID, they gave out 4 years worth of awards all at once during a daytime ceremony. So I got to meet so many luminaries. Got to hang out with Dempsey Bob and David Rubin Piktukin and all of these other people that I have. So there was a lot of mutual fandom being expressed. But the very best moment was when the Governor General, Mary Simon, who's a Nook, was giving out an award to Germaine, Anartayuk. And they just stopped everything and they just had a little conversation in Inuktitut. And that was just the best. It was just like everyone was just, I feel like everyone's hearts were just warming. We're just melting in the audience. Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, it's so well deserved, and I hope you had a wonderful time there. And I think it's so important to recognize people that, because you know you've been at this a long time, doing so many, juggling multiple projects, you know, and not having an institutional position, you know, in a way like the difficulty of maintaining that life of making work. And I'm thinking now that you know we have a lot of students who listen to this who are earlier in their art careers or just finishing school, and what advice you might have to, you know, how do you survive those lean years, those difficult years when you're in between projects, and how do you make your financial life work, you know?
Yeah, for sure. It's, well, the sad news is that it's never not a struggle. Like even it's like 35 years I've been doing this now. It's still a precarious life. So that can sort of, you know, start to weigh on you after a while. You know, so the way that I've made it work is by doing things that most young artists who will do, which is have part-time jobs. So I have been teaching sessionally on and off. I do that. For me, I piece together a whole bunch of different types of work. Sometimes I do public art contracts. Sometimes I do consultation. Artist fees that you get from exhibiting are never really enough to live on. So it's some combination of modest living plus piecing together various bits of like little tiny bits of income. Yeah, and on one hand, you could say there's a kind of freedom that comes with that, but at the same time, you lose a lot of time towards the kind of making things, just piecing things together. But at the same time, there's, you just have to keep doing it, and you never know when things are going to bear fruit. The kinds of, everything you do sometimes, has the possibility of leading to another thing. Like, for example, I just had a call last week from someone who had seen a show that I did in 2004. So almost 20 years later, I got the call from someone who saw a show and wants to, and is wondering about working together. So it's not always going to be that long, but you also can never tell what's going to come out of anything that you do. So you just have to find a way to keep doing it. Important for younger artists, that are making the bridge from school to an ongoing practice is to find some way, whatever you can do to not stop working. I know we were just talking about the fallacy of productivity, but I'm more talking about not losing momentum in a sense and not losing track of the community that you have around you. Like being in school, you've got built-in community. But if you can somehow assemble a community around you as you're leaving school of people that you can talk to, people that, that you can mutually support, where you can mount things together, invent your own shows and so on. Those are the kinds of little strategies that you can enact to help you through those, to keep the practice going, right? Yeah.
Germaine, I wonder if you can talk about what are some projects you have currently going on right now, or you're thinking about doing.
Sure. I started up a working group that has coalesced around a project that we're calling Fleet, which in some way grows out of the work I've been doing around construction, in that 2019, I acted as the general contractor and construction manager for the Blue Cabin Floating Artist Residency, which is a new organization in town that was formed to rehabilitate the Blue Cabin, which was we need to give a bit of background information on that. The Blue Cabin was the last of the so-called squatters' shacks that were on Burrard Inlet, existing in the intertidal area. So it was the last of this kind of community of self-built dwellings, and that was going to be evicted or removed in 2015. A group of arts organizations got together and saved it, rehabilitated it, and put it onto a float along with a new deck house, which I built. So I built the new studio. And that floating artist residency now is moving around the waterways of the Lower Mainland, the waterways adjacent to the mainland, serving as an artist residency. And I said to some of the people that I'd worked with, associated with other sites for artists projects, which was one of the organizations involved there, that we should bring that kind of energy to land as well and start up an organization that would build a fleet of mobile artist studios that would at the same time address the continuing loss of artist studio spaces, which we're seeing around Vancouver, and potentially bring artist production to unexpected locations within the city, like residential areas or places that are not particularly well served by arts infrastructure. So we have, scaled. We've done the groundwork, community consultation and design processes with the local First Nations and community. And we're just heading into a construction process where we're going to build 2 of those studios. So one of them is going to land at Edmonds Park in Burnaby for the first couple of years. The other location we haven't quite settled on, but the construction process is happening at Granville Island as we speak. So that's one. I've also, I don't know if this is, maybe it's partly Salt Spring acting on me, but I've taken up weaving. They have a very craft-based art world there. A big creative community, and it's largely craft-based. But yeah, so I'm making some woven objects that are sitting kind of in the realm of fashion or fashion adjacent, but very slow fashion. Like I'm taking apart discarded clothing and weaving the threads back into new fabric, and then sewing the fabric into these into garments, or else using discarded plastic bags and making fabric out of those. So it's very slow fashion objects.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
Thanks for having me. Nice to chat.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Germaine Koh. You can head to the show notes to learn more about her work and ongoing projects. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.